Hello, everybody. My name is Aldo Cagliari. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Campaigns at Jubilee USA Network, and I want to welcome you all to this event on climate justice and debt, opportunities and challenges for Global South countries in a context of multiple crises. We have a great set of speakers that are going to give a different perspective from different regions of the world on this topic. As you know, we have at the moment, the world is going through multiple crises that require global cooperation. This all is taking place against the context of one big global crisis, which is the COVID crisis, and the health and economic impacts of this crisis are continuing to play out. But we want to talk today about, in particular, two other global challenges that also are crises at the moment. One is climate change, and something that we continue to see growing in intensity and in speed. We see more natural disasters, the reduction in arable farmland and the productivity of land, with the consequences for food security in large parts of the world, spread of diseases in new areas, where the diseases were not present, large displacements and migration, loss of water resources. And something that we have also witnessed in how climate change is playing out is those least responsible for causing the increase in emissions are the ones that are most exposed to its consequences. We have heard many countries actually speak in the recent UN General Assembly of an existential crisis to their countries. Existential because one key element of the state, which is territory, they don't know if they will have a territory anymore in a few years because of the rise in sea levels, which is another consequence of climate change. And the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that unless there is immediate, rapid, and large-scale reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to close to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees will be beyond reach. So COVID crisis offers an opportunity, and perhaps the last one we have for structural transformation with the speed and the timeliness required to halt climate change. And here is where our other crisis enters into the scene, which is the debt crisis, because that transformation, if it is going to happen, will require large investments in mitigation, in adaptation. And in fact, for instance, 70% of the projected investment needs on sustainable infrastructure that need to happen in the next 10 or 15 years need to happen in emerging market and developing countries. Countries other than China account for most of that increase. And at the same time, we know that developing countries as a whole have to pay some 330 billion annually in debt service in the next 5 years. So it's very difficult to reconcile these two pictures. So with that in the background, I'm going to give the floor to our first speakers, who is the manager of policy and advocacy at Eurodas, Yolanda Fresnillo. Yolanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aldo. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to just go a little bit over these interlinkages between the debt crisis and the climate emergency that Aldo introduced, and let the other speakers kind of comment more on the proposals and the more political analysis on that. I think the first issue is as following with what Aldo was saying. As countries in the global south need large investment in mitigation, in adaptation, but also to face loss and damage. Most of this investment is at the moment being covered by new borrowing. So in fact, fueling the indebtedness in emerging markets and in low-income countries. Together with this, the impacts of the climate emergency, of the climate crisis in the global south, are actually exacerbating the debt problems. This is because most countries have little or no option other than borrowing to deal with the recovery and the destruction and the reconstruction costs after a climate extreme event. It's not only CSOs who said that, but for instance, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, analyzed not long ago 11 cases of major natural disasters, what they call natural disasters in developing countries, with a percentage of damage in their GDP greater than 20%. And the results showed that public debt increased from an average of 68% of GDP in the year of the climate event to 75% of GDP 3 years afterwards. So there is an increase in the debt levels in the countries in most cases of big climate extreme events and other disasters. Jubilee debt campaign, Jubilee Germany have also produced several reports showing how this is happening in concrete countries. Beyond that, when an overly indebted country is affected by one of these climate extreme events, existing debt makes it more difficult for the country to respond to the emergency needs. This happens because there doesn't exist any debt standstill or state contingent clauses are not expanded enough, so the country can stop paying, even if it's temporarily, its debt. So it has to continue repaying debt services at the same time as they have to face this emergency and reconstruction costs. Another element that we need to take into account is existing climate finance. So governments in the global north have committed to provide climate finance to developing countries. But the problem is that this climate finance has mostly been provided also through debt creating instruments, so through loans mainly. And this also is helping fueling the debt crisis. According to the latest OECD data, between 2013 and 2019, 2/3 of public climate finance was delivered through loans. And this is particularly the case for climate finance from multilateral development banks, as 88% of multilateral climate finance is in the form of loans. This is particularly worrying because this means that the net climate finance, so the actual money that stays into the country, is lower than the climate finance that the countries are allegedly saying they are providing. As according to Oxfam estimates, public climate finance in 2018 in net value could be as low as $19 to $22 billion, and not the $79 billion that the OECD says that the climate finance has been provided. And I'm going to finish with a couple of more things. Another element to take into account is how climate vulnerabilities are increasing the costs of borrowing, both from private creditors and from public creditors. There's a recent report showing how climate risks are increasing the cost of debt for the countries, for instance, of the V20, the vulnerable 20 group of countries. And in the last 10 years, this has added a cost of over $40 billion of additional costs in interest payments. And in over the next decade, this could increase up to 168 billions. And finally, we need to understand also how debt impacts into the climate emergency. So when, and I think Aldo already addressed this, when a country is facing high levels of public debt, this means that more parts of its revenue is being spent into servicing that debt, and therefore there is a limited domestic resources to invest in climate adaptation and mitigation and to respond to the challenge of loss and damage after a climate extreme event. And finally, struggling with unsustainable debts, countries might also be looking for options, including exploitation of natural resources, including fossil fuels, mining and forests in order to increase exports and therefore revenues to be able to repay those debts. And this is in turn contributing to further climate change and facilitating, for instance, desertification, among many other impacts. In conclusion, and I'm finishing to that, countries that are struggling most with debt tend to be more vulnerable to the impact of climate change. But also, on the other hand, climate change is actually exacerbating the debt vulnerabilities. This is extremely problematic as it creates a vicious circle. And in order to tackle both crises, we need to tackle both problems. So providing debt cancellation, but also providing not debt creating climate finance. And I'll leave it at there.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. Thank you for raising the very important issue of the accounting of climate finance. And I hope we'll get the chance to come back to that because it is very important when there are commitments, but then sometimes those commitments it's important that the fine print of how to fulfill the commitments also respects the spirit, what was the purpose of the commitment. So, and the other very important picture that you share with us, thank you for laying out this issue of the vicious cycle going from climate vulnerability, how it makes countries more prone to debt problems, but also then the problems make it harder to tackle climate vulnerabilities. And in addition to all this, I would say in both of these cycles, this common element is the most vulnerable are the ones that suffer most, no? The ones that are least responsible, that least benefited from so these are the ones that have to bear the consequences, and that is an issue of really of fairness that I think we need to address also in policy. That I'm going to now give the floor to Carola Mejia. She's a climate expert with Latindadd. She's recently wrote a report that she's going to share with us on analyzing international climate finance in Latin America and the Caribbean. Carola, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Aldo, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the audience. Thank you very much for joining us in this side event. As Aldo and Yolanda were already mentioning, the climate crisis is real. The increasingly frequent occurrence of extreme climate events such as hurricanes, droughts, and storms, among others, leads to several disasters that affect the population, put in risk also a lot of species, generate large economic losses and damages that are not being fairly compensated to countries less responsible for this problem, and also puts in risk the survival of humankind. So science has been very clear about this. There is less than 10 years to transform our current models of development. Otherwise, we're going to be very late to tackle climate change and to achieve resilience. The main emitters are, until 2019, China and United States, the European Union, India, Russia. And well, internationally, it has been recognized that there is a historical climate debt of several countries, especially from the global north, within the framework of common but differentiated responsibilities. The negative impacts of climate change transcend borders and are affecting especially countries from the south that are less responsible for this crisis. For example, Latin America and the Caribbean is responsible for less than 10% of GHG emissions. However, it's a highly vulnerable region, as we can see in this map, with Africa and Asia, and it's continuously being affected by climate extreme events that generate, as I mentioned already, damages and economic losses, puts at risk food, water, and energy security of the entire region, and is causing a lot of migration also within the region. And as Aldo was mentioning, it's affecting the most vulnerable groups, especially. Also, at the international level, within the framework of the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, it has been a goal of mobilizing $100 billion annually has been set. from developed countries to developing countries, this goal has not been reached yet. So that's something that is very important to know. And in the negotiations, another thing that I want to mention is that the issue of loss and damage has not advanced much, which is something that countries from the global south are requesting a lot. So it is an obligation of developed countries to repair the climate debt of to less developed countries which are suffering which are being most affected by these negative impacts of climate change. Between 2016 and 2018, the average annual flow of climate finance that reached that was mobilized globally was $69.4 billion, from which to poor and middle income countries, 33.5 billion were allocated. To Latin America and the Caribbean, only 17% of that total amount, 12 billion, and to small island developing states, 1.5 billion. If we see these flows by impact, we can see that 72% of the flows were focused on mitigation projects, which is something that it's very important to know also, because we also need a lot of adaptation efforts in order to adapt to climate change. Therefore, the international goal of mobilizing 100 billion annually from developed countries to developing countries has not been met yet. And it's urgent to channel more financing towards adaptation measures, mainly in high vulnerable regions like Latin America. In my region, in 2008, we received $9.09 billion, from which around 90% were loans, especially from multilateral development banks. In our region, the most important banks are the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and CAF. And Brazil was the country receiving more of this finance, but as I was mentioning, most of it came as loans. And around 90% of these loans increase, of course, the debt levels that are already high in the context of multiple crises. And as Yolanda was mentioning, greater climate vulnerabilities implies higher borrowing costs for our countries, greater macroeconomic volatility, higher risk of debt and sustainability, lower long-term growth prospect. And if we see that from the other side, higher debt service implies less fiscal space to finance climate change mitigation and adaptation measures, less chances to obtain any funding to recover after disasters, less possibilities of financing other populations' needs and rights, and more pressure, as Yolanda was mentioning, for developing countries to overexploit natural resources and promote extractive and high polluting activities, for example, in hydrocarbon sector, mining sector, to pay their debt services. So climate crisis is exacerbating debt vulnerability, affecting mainly the most vulnerable groups, which implies that debt and climate crisis are accumulating injustice in the world. And as Aldo was already mentioning, we're living in a difficult context of multiple crises. Many crises have been putting us in a very difficult situation, which is increasing the social fragility and vulnerability of the most vulnerable groups, especially in developing countries. The convergence of crises in the last 2 years has weakened the climate agenda, both globally and also nationally, which makes economical, social, and environmental challenges greater and negatively affect mainly most vulnerable groups. These multiple crises has exacerbated serious structural problems that Latin America already and historically faced. So, for example, high levels of poverty, unemployment, informality, insecurity, inequity, and high levels of debt, of course, to the detriment of the entire population. The main challenge of this COVID context is that, it's weakening the climate agenda. The reallocation of national and international public resources destined for climate change towards sectors linked to the tension of the pandemic. The risk of decreasing in climate finance also, that is something we're going to see in reports in the next years. The risk of lack of transparency and accountability about using these resources, and also to get out from this economic crisis, many governments are applying reactivation packages in extractive sectors. For example, in my country, hydrocarbons, mining, agribusiness, which are of course accelerating the climate crisis instead of addressing it. And just to finish this, I want to make some final remarks. Developed countries must meet the goal of mobilizing 100 billion annually, which in fact must be higher. In this COP, maybe a new goal will be set, given the financing needs and multiple challenges. Within the framework of the global finance architecture, the use of non-debt creating instruments should be promoted in favor of developing and less developed countries. Moratorium on debt restructuring for countries affected by adverse climate-related events, and immediate access to non-debt generating resources to cover loss and damages. For example, last year and this year, Central America has been affected by a lot of hurricanes, and is also dealing with all this pandemic and all the crises. So it is very important to help these countries maybe restructure the debts or make them not pay the debt right now, and if possible, of course, cancel the debts that are unfair. Within the framework of the climate change negotiations, progress must be made in mobilizing financing to cover losses and damages derived from climate change, which I mentioned. It's a topic that it has not made a lot of progress in negotiations. From the Global South, we request financial mechanisms that transfer money to the countries that are being most affected by climate change, but different money from the ones from the funds that are already focused on adaptation and mitigation. These should be new mechanisms to help them cover these losses and damages that are usually covered by debt. More resources must be mobilized for adaptations. As we see, mitigation is receiving 72% of the total flows of climate finance, and that's a very important issue to notice. And financing must guarantee the projects include gender and ethnic approach, both in the design and implementation stages. And of course, efforts should be made to decarbonize economies and reducing national and international finance for extractive activities, mainly fossil fuels, which is one of the main causes of climate change, as science has shown. For that final point, we need a lot of political will from our governments to really change the trend. To really change the models of development that we are used to implement in our countries. For example, in Latin America has relied historically in extractivism, and that fuels, of course, the capitalistic system that has been widening the inequities in the world, and it's causing these crises that are arising and that we can see we are facing now, such as climate crisis and of course the pandemic, that is also showing us that these models are unsustainable and that we have to tackle them with efforts before they happen. The pandemic showed us that we are not ready for attending such a crisis as such as the one that we're facing, and the climate crisis is going to be worse because we're not going to solve it with a vaccine, with quarantines. That's going to be some of the causes and effects are already irreversible, as the IPCC report was showing us. So we have to really act now. The decisions we make today and in the next 7 years are decisive for to guarantee a planet and a sustainable future for all of us. So I'm going to leave the presentation here, and I invite you to read the Latindadd report of analysis of international climate finance in Latin America and the Caribbean for a climate and financial justice approach that is going to have more data and more information about these topics I presented, and also from other topics I was presenting. It focused on data from the OECD until 2018. The new report has recently published, and what I can say regarding that report, and Yolani was already mentioning, is that the numbers have increased a little bit, but they are not meeting the goal of mobilizing 100 billion per year. So the efforts should be doubled or tripled in this next year. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carola. Many important points in your presentation, but thank you for also reminding us the issue of adaptation and the sort of deficit about adaptation. And also, I hope we'll get the chance to also talk more about loss and damage, and this struggle also to have a way to address this important aspect, which is about what are the impacts that countries suffer due to natural disasters year after year. They end up having to take actually more debt to respond to those crises. So that and also the picture in Latin America that I hope will also there will be more questions. I want to at this point remind people who are watching this event that you can enter your question on the chat, and I'm monitoring the chat. I will be posing your questions to the panelists. So things that you would like to hear more about, please write them up there. I'm now going to invite our next panelist, who is Jason Braganza, the Executive Director of Afrodad, to share with us. Jason is going to discuss the political economy behind the narrative on climate justice and what that political economy is in Africa, and also some other thoughts about the trade-offs in structural transformation and climate justice, how they are seen in the African continent. The floor is yours, Jason.
Aldo, thank you very much, and thank you to Yolanda and Carola for laying a very good foundation for my presentation. I don't have a slide, just a few talking points that I'd like to share with colleagues who are tuned in. So to start off with, I think the beginning point is it seems that we're on the continent especially, we're in a constant state of perpetual crisis. If it's not a pandemic that we're currently dealing with, it's now a debt crisis. If it's not a debt crisis, it's the climate crisis. If it's not the climate crisis, it's infrastructure deficits that are undermining the structural transformation of the continent. And so there's this perpetual crisis mode that as a continent we're always faced with. And as a result of that, there's very little breathing space for policymakers and for governments to actually take a step back and actually try to react to what is happening and understand what kind of direction the continent needs to take with regard to its policy interventions, either as 54 individual countries or as one collective with a common position. And why is this important in the context of the climate justice debate and its dotted line to the debt justice conversation that we're having today? For three reasons. The continent, as Carola's image, one of her infographics showed, is that the continent is the worst affected when it comes to issues of climate change. The country where I'm based in Kenya, when I was growing up, the cycle of droughts or famine, were every 5 to 7 years. Now it's almost down to every 2 to 3 years. And so that's a real effect or a real impact of what climate change actually means. But that when you couple that with other types of crises with regard to, the economic lack of economic diversification, the dependency on borrowing, and other governance issues, which means that the government cannot generate its revenues, then as policymakers, there's such a huge balance that needs to be reached. And when there hasn't been sufficient time to reflect on what does the climate justice or what does climate change mean for a country like Kenya, and then more broadly a continent, the African continent, it's very challenging to see what narrative should be pursued, especially now in the context of a global pandemic and that has accelerated the debt crisis. Should African governments, pay a lot more attention to the climate crisis as we're faced, as Carola's presentation has presented, or should we be looking at some of the more nuanced aspects of the climate justice and the climate change conversations that Yolanda has presented around this dependency on private instruments or private debt instruments. And so it's a very difficult balance of where which narrative should be followed. Or is there a third option where African governments can actually take a step back and say, for us, the priority really is to look at how do we do more mitigation and adaptation investment? So this is with regard to agricultural methods. It's in regards to moving up the value chain and transforming their economies in such a way that tax revenues begin to flow into the economies and that can then be reinvested in dealing with some of the socioeconomic issues and challenges facing these governments, and then have enough policy space to then figure out how to deal with the climate emergency that they are facing. At the moment, we do not have the liberty of that policy space, nor do we have the liberty of that time. And therefore, when we look at the political narrative that the continent is pursuing, it's one that's maybe driven primarily from external forces, and one that they have to or are cajoled into endorsing, because that's where also the money trail comes from. So in order to secure resources, whether it's from bilateral partners or other commercial creditors, African governments are being forced to toe the line. That is external to the continent, and I think this is a very important part of the conversation when we're talking about building forward together out of this crisis. How do we have a collective position that takes into account different perspectives and different experiences of the climate emergency across the different parts of the world? The third point I wanted to make with regard to this conversation is the over-dependence or over-reliance on development finance coming through private and commercial instruments. I think development finance has evolved so much that even traditional lenders, bilateral countries, are also resorting to redirecting their debt instruments through private instruments, and this is a very dangerous direction that we're going to. And Yolanda spoke to this about the debt creating instruments that are being used to finance to do climate finance work. And so you then have this perpetual cycle of debt financing related activities, even if it is for what might be considered a broader good, like addressing the climate emergency. Actually, at the macroeconomic level or national level in a country, in order to do that, the country is actually indebting itself in order to deal with the climate emergency. And I think there is an important need, particularly in the African context, for us to address that issue of how do we mitigate or prevent the indebtedness of African governments getting worse or spiraling out of control, in a bid to then also deal with the climate emergency, which is a real thing, which has a real impact on the continent. And then, of course, lastly is the policy trade-offs that many of our governments are faced with. The African Development Bank recently, in its report, announced that women-headed households are likely to be the biggest proportion of the newly poor on the continent due to COVID-19. This is no mean statistic when you look at a continent that's growing as fast as a population is growing as fast as Africa's is. And then you couple that on with the positive steps that the continent has made towards socioeconomic transformation and opportunities for both for women and girls in particular. There's a huge risk that these gains might be reversed as a result of the pandemic. So from a policy perspective, what are governments supposed to, what are the kind of policy choices that they're faced with? There's a second point around lost opportunities or lost income due to missed education opportunities on the continent. The pandemic has brought, massive or significant lockdowns, closures of schools, loss of jobs and incomes for many households. So that means several families or households have had to take very serious decisions as to whether they continue sending their children to school. And so when you compute, I think the IMF estimated this to be close to $50 billion in lost earnings for the continent due to missed education opportunities. So when you talk about those type of socioeconomic challenges and you throw into the equation the climate emergency, and then you've got the debt servicing commitments that African governments have got to commit to and honor, you've got a ticking time bomb on the continent and such a difficult policy balance that needs to be considered. So I think, part of my presentation is to say that this is an emergency. The climate emergency is real. The continent is facing detrimental impacts through loss and damage that we need to look at. But I think there's a bigger, broader conversation on two aspects, in terms of the narrative that African governments and the continent needs to follow, but also in terms of the interventions, in terms of the types of instruments that are being proposed as being supposedly supposed to get us out of this climate emergency that are debt-inducing. And I think it's very interesting for us to be able to have those two conversations simultaneously if we are actually supposed to come out of this a little bit more stronger and better than we were pre-COVID. So I think I'll just stop there and then look forward to the comments and questions that come through. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for also reminding us that there are different ways to look at this in different regions. And also, I think it goes back to some extent to the issue of the equity in the response. It's clear that the ones that will have the most impact in reversing the climate crisis are not the countries in Africa, are countries it are most developed countries. So it's in terms of the burden of the action, there is also the important issue of what are the transition times for countries and perhaps those that have the least capacity. The concept of common and differentiated responsibilities, which is a historical also a concept here that is very important and we should not forget. I have one question that came in earlier, and I don't know who would like to take it. It's about reducing interest rates to negative by linking refinancing to SDR guaranteeing and new borrowing. So this is, as you know, there is a recent allocation of special drawing rights that there is some discussion about how that's going to be channeled to developing countries, how developed countries are going to be able to channel some of those special drawing rights to the poorest countries. And so I think in this context, the question is how SDRs could help perhaps in vehicles that could reduce the burden by making the payments negative. I don't know if anybody has a view on that you can share. Yolanda, maybe? Not to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. Well, a couple of thoughts on that. One would be, and following what I think Jason was also saying, is that in order to change things, we need to start doing things differently. So we need to break this dependency in the global south from financial markets, from accessing lending to be able to do the investments on climate adaptation and mitigation. This means that climate finance to allow these investments should be made public, so publicly disbursed for public projects, and in the form of grants or highly concessional loans. So this is one of the ways to reduce debt costs, which is focusing on public climate finance, either in the form of grants or highly concessional loans. On the issue of SDRs, several civil society organizations, including the ones represented here, Jubilee USA, Latindadd, Afrodad, and Eurodas, have proposed in a letter a series of principles in which we think the SDRs could be rechanneled. One of these is non-debt creation. So I don't know how this fits with this idea of using the SDRs as an instrument to back private financing and lower the cost of this private financing. I understand this shouldn't be the priority. So SDR should be made available for direct investment in the global south in a form that, if possible, should be non-debt creating and in a very, or at least at a very concessional, highly concessional levels. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad idea, but I don't think it's the priority at this point. But I'll happy for the others to comment on that.
Thank you, Yolanda. And we have another, it's more like a comment coming through the chat about whether we should be talking in the same way we talk about net zero, also talk about net flows when we talk about climate finance, and only count the net flows, especially taking into account the debt creating climate finance that you were referring to. So I want to maybe I'll pose a question to the panelists also. Of course, this is a C20 and it's the engagement group for the G20, and I think there is a very important reason why we are having this conversation here, because there will be important decisions that the G20 makes on actually on both, on climate and on finance and on debt as part of finance, that are going to, even by default, in some cases, the failure to act, that will have consequences for whether we can address the climate crisis. And I don't know if how each of you see the priorities, what the G20, what to be should be the main action that the G20 should take, especially thinking of the summit coming up, finance ministers meeting next week, summit coming up at the end of the month. And we also know that these actions are going to set the stage for what is possible, or what is the limit of the possible in COP26 next month. No? This is another important global opportunity. And also, we have the Finance in Common Summit in almost 3 week time. And that is also it's an important, all 450 development banks last year made this commitment to align their activities with the Paris Agreement. This is something that the G20 has also been asking the multilateral development banks to do. They have time-bound commitments and be very clear about a timeline by when they will align their activities with the commitments in the Paris Agreement. And so there are lots of important public policy decision-making moments coming up, and I wonder if each of you could say what would be like your 2 priorities for maybe taking them as a whole. Where would you see the key action that needs to be taken, and what those key actions are? Maybe I'll start with reverse order now with Jason.
Great, thank you very much. In fact, I'll pick up very quickly first on the first question, and I think the important thing there to note is, even though the SDRs provide us as a special reserve, one would have to be very cautious what negative interest rates might mean in terms of currency fluctuations and potentially what that sort of signals it may send to market, even though it may have a counterintuitive approach to how people interpret negative interest rates. So I think you need to be very cautious there in pursuing that kind of policy response. With regard to the policies priorities for the 2 priorities for the G20, I think This is an interesting one. It's to know where to start. I think the first one is really on the common framework. Really on debt treatment is to really try and move the dial. Not necessarily on the current countries that have signed up, but move the dial on the creditors that haven't joined or not part of the common framework. I think there really needs to be some level of push to get the G20 countries to exert some level of pressure, particularly on the IFIs and commercial creditors. I think the second one would be to desist or discourage bilateral conversations that are taking place, because I think that really acts as a disincentive towards a truly common approach. I think there's some of the wealthier countries that are trying to pursue things bilaterally. Countries like France, for example, with their summit with the heads of state of Africa, that are trying to do things on their own. And I think this serves as a very pervasive way to try and get us onto a common ground of how to deal with the current debt crisis. And I think finally, some sort of recognition that a truly politically equal and equitable way of dealing with this crisis is really where all countries are able to make decisions and also able to take to put proposals on the table, irrespective of whether they're borrowers or lenders. And this means that developing countries should be in a position to define what kind of framework is in place. And so I think, implicitly what I'm saying is maybe there's another forum also for us to consider where this kind of conversation could be happening, where all countries have an equal voice as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. Carola?
Well, as we already mentioned, most of the G20 countries have been historically most responsible of climate change, so they have to do a lot in their territories, but also in this global effort to tackle climate change. And that means not only mobilizing and committing a lot of money to help developing countries also reach low carbon development models or more resilient models of development, but also to stop investing in fossil fuels. They are investing in our countries in big projects related to mining, hydrocarbons, and this has to stop because we don't have much time. And it's also about not just committing a big amount of money, but also meeting these commitments, making them real. And I also think it's important to restructure the international financial architecture. We saw that these flows are just creating more debts, and we need another instrument, another financial system to be put in place in order to help countries that are being most affected by all these crises. And we need more. There are the climate funds that aim to channel more flows, more finance in form of, for example, grants. But the data I didn't share with you in the presentation is that Latin America only uses 10% of the total climate finance that it receives comes from these climate funds. So they are not being really effective as we could use them. So that could be because these climate funds, as the Green Climate Fund, have a lot of bureaucracy behind, and the projects are very difficult to approve. It takes around 2 years to approve a project, so it's very difficult. And considering the lack of capabilities we have in our continents, it's also another thing to take in mind, and another thing that should receive a lot of support from developed countries in order to make better projects, in order to guarantee that these projects are implemented successfully. And I think considering the COP that is coming, C20 countries and all the countries in the world should really be more ambitious regarding not only climate finance, but also climate efforts, mitigation and adaptation efforts, because they presented their NDCs, their national determined contributions, but they the report that was published 2 weeks ago showed us that if these commitments are met and implemented effectively, we are very, very far away from the trend towards the 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5. So we are very far away from the goal that we have set for the Paris Agreement. So I think a lot needs to be done. Unfortunately, G20 countries are the ones that have more power and more weight in the decisions. So they should really take these multiple crises into account and see that these decisions that they are going to take in all these events and international negotiations are going to be very important. That should listen to the needs of the global south.
Thank you. I guess it's my turn. Thank you both, and I echo all of the proposals, and you actually took my kind of top points. And I really think what Carola was just saying, that the responsibility of the G20 in actually being more ambitious, not only in relation to climate finance or debt cancellation, which is what we're talking in this event, but particularly on the efforts that we need to make in the global north countries to reduce carbon emissions. I think that's the most important. That being said, I think there are also other issues that the G20 could make steps forward. For instance, on relation to responsible lending and borrowing, and including and advancing on the state contingent clauses, and particularly the use of hurricane clauses or other climate-related clauses in any new lending. And I think this is particularly relevant in relation to what Aldo was mentioning of the Financing Common Summit. So this could be a commitment by multilateral development banks to include state contingent clauses in order lending. Also, for instance, taking on one of the proposals that many Caribbean countries, mostly like climate vulnerable countries, have been putting out there on using multidimensional indicators to decide who can access concessional finance or who can access debt relief, including climate vulnerabilities in those in this new indicator. This is because the main indicator today is GDP per capita, and this leaves out of the access of climate finance many countries in need, and particularly small island developing states in need of access this kind of climate finance, but also debt relief schemes like the DSSI or new restructuring frameworks like the Common Framework. And another issue should be, and I think this is urgent also, is a review of the debt sustainability concept of the debt sustainability assessment by the IMF and the World Bank, but in general, the approach to debt sustainability. We cannot consider that debt is sustainable in a country that cannot do a minimum of investments on climate resilience, but also on public services, for instance. And I think one of the things that hasn't, and we've said that in the presentation, but one of the things that from civil society we've been calling for is this idea of an automatic debt payments standstill when a climate extreme event happens. This is something that could be easily be agreed in UNFCCC in COP26 in November, and the G20 countries could take on board to promote this support for countries facing the impacts already of the climate emergency by providing this automatic moratorium of debt payments when they are hit by a hurricane or another climate extreme event, and then provide debt restructuring, including debt cancellation that they need after the event happens. I think this is also something that they could promote and adhere to, and it's been a long time such civil society demand. There are many other things, of course, but this would be a summary.
Thank you, Yolanda. And I I think that it's the issue of the state contingent debt clauses and how we change the debt architecture. I always wondered about this. The climate is now at its fault. As I remember being stuck in an airport once when and the airline wanted me to pay for the stay at that place because I couldn't go to my next destination. And I said, why do I have to pay? If this is a weather issue, and the airline said, the person at the airline, the weather is now at its fault. But then I said, well, but then why does that mean I have to bear the cost of it? If it's now at its fault, at least we should share it, right? And that, I think, it's something that we see missing, instruments that would allow countries, debtors and creditors to actually share the risks of these natural disasters or other events that are really outside the control of anybody at the moment. But that doesn't mean it's the debtor that needs to end up carrying the cost. And I think it would be so important, even as we advance solutions to the current debt crisis that mean restructuring, relieving debts for countries, that towards the future we have these contracts in place, because otherwise we are going to continue to recreate the debt problem once and again, and we just at this point cannot afford that. And the other issue I wanted to reference, debt swaps, which is something I have done some research on, and of course I don't think anybody at this point would consider so useful to have debt swaps the way that for nature swaps were 20 years ago. They were very small, a lot of transaction costs for a very small return. And also they were a lot about public debt. And at the moment, the big problem is private debt. But I think there is space to consider some solution that would involve all creditors, especially the private creditors, in debt swaps to address climate issues, and that is something that will require a lot of public policy to guide it, to make it happen in the right way, to really involve the private creditors. At the moment, we don't have enough public policy even to involve the private creditors in a normal debt restructuring, so let alone a swap. But I think if we are going to talk about debt swaps at a scale that we need them to happen to really be a significant solution for the debt problem, they need to be involving all creditors. And that is something that I hope we're going to see some consideration also in the G20. I understand the IMF is preparing some a proposal on this that's going to come up soon. So we'll have to look into that and what that means for the debt and the climate crisis. I don't know if there are final comments. We have 2 minutes left. I don't have more questions in the chat, so maybe I'll just give quickly the floor for a 30-second final intervention to each of you. And this time I'm going to start with Yolanda.
Thank you, Aldo. And on that last issue of the debt for climate swaps and other kinds of swaps, and I think we really need to talk about the scaling and the nuances of the different operations. But it's definitely something that we need to keep exploring. A final call would be for people to join the different campaigns and the different conversations that will be coming in the following weeks. Next week, we will be launching a statement by several CSOs on debt justice and climate justice, and some actions will follow that. So if you follow any of the organizations in the panel, you probably have more information about these and other events and proposals to keep calling for debt justice and climate justice, to sum up. Thank you.
Carola?
I just want to thank you all for this interesting conversation. It's something that we just discussed a little bit, but it needs more time, of course. And we, as Yolanda was saying, we invite you all to be more active in these matters relating climate justice, climate debt, and you can join us in these movements, global movements, regional movements, civil society efforts to make the global south be heard in this global bodies that take decisions regarding what's going to be next in this planet. So I think it's very important to be very active, to also be very active within our countries, with our governments, and to let them know the urgency that we have to tackle this climate crisis, and also the relationship, the strong relationship with climate, with that we need to recognize and tackle. Thank you very much.
Jason?
Well, I think it's all been said, really. But I mean, for me, the last one is just about voice. I think the voice of developing regions, particularly in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, in how decisions are being made, is critical. And voice here means voice of the citizens, voice of the public, and then voice of our leaders. And that's what we also, part of the campaigns that Yolanda and Carola have talked about is also about that. It's, to legitimize an international process or an inclusive process, all voices need to be represented from across the world. So yeah, for me, that's what I'd say. Thank you.
That's a great note to end, Jason. And I really hope in that spirit that with this event, we have done a little bit to project the voice of civil society on this important conversation and trying to increase our understanding of the connection between climate and death and the possible solutions that can be given to it, and that we can all come out of this with some more ideas on how we can advocate for this in all the different forums and that we are working on, the UN, the C20, the Financing Common, and others. Well, these two issues are really so important, and we cannot afford to waste any more time in addressing them. So thank you very much to everybody, also to our audience that joined, and I look forward to further conversations in the future. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.